Have you ever wondered how a split-second decision can impact your entire life? What if a seemingly routine situation suddenly turned upside down, leaving you stunned and questioning everything? In this video, we're diving into one of those rare moments that went from ordinary to unforgettable in just a matter of minutes. When a police officer pulls over a driver he believes he knows, assumptions are made, and lines are crossed. But then, something shocking happens. This isn't your typical driver. This man holds a powerful secret, one that's about to turn the entire situation around. But what happens next? Why did the officer make such a hasty judgment? And what unexpected twist left him questioning everything he thought he knew? Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story about an arrest. It's about a powerful lesson in respect, humility, and the danger of jumping to conclusions. Watching this video all the way through could change how you think about the snap decisions we make every day and what they say about us. So, why should you watch until the end? Here's what this story will reveal. 1. The hidden power of perception. How our first impressions and quick judgments can lead to major mistakes. 2. An unexpected role reversal, where the one with authority becomes the one who is truly vulnerable. 3. The consequences of assumptions. Why it's crucial to question what we think we know about others before acting on it. This video will take you on a journey filled with unexpected twists, a touch of irony, and a karmic twist that hits hard. It's a reminder that in every interaction, there's more beneath the surface than meets the eye. Whether you're a fan of real-life drama, lessons on social behavior, or just love a story with a twist, this one is for you. At first glance, it seemed like any ordinary traffic stop. The police officer, feeling confident and sure of his authority, approached the car, clipboard in hand, fully expecting the situation to be routine. But as he reached the window, there was something he hadn't anticipated. A calmness, a poise in the man behind the wheel that seemed different. This wasn't the nervous, anxious reaction he often saw. No, this was something else. But in that moment, the officer didn't pause to reflect. He had a job to do, after all. The officer began asking questions, his tone firm and slightly suspicious. He had already made up his mind about the driver, allowing his assumptions to steer his words and actions. To him, this was a standard procedure, a quick check, a ticket, and then he'd be on his way. But as he looked into the man's eyes, there was a quiet confidence there that made him uneasy. For a second, a brief flash of doubt crossed his mind. What if I got this all wrong? He wondered, but he pushed the thought aside. The driver, however, didn't argue or protest. Instead, he reached calmly into his wallet, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. He handed over his ID, not with fear or frustration, but with an almost knowing smile. The officer took the ID, barely glancing at it at first, but then his eyes froze. Right there, under the man's name, was a line he never expected to see: Central Intelligence Agency. He blinked, the words sinking in, each letter carrying a new weight as he realized exactly who he was dealing with. The realization struck him hard. He wasn't just speaking to any driver. This man was someone with access to secrets, someone trained in intelligence, someone who knew things most people would never dream of. A chill ran down the officer's spine. He had gone from a position of power to one of uncertainty in a matter of seconds. Now he was the one who felt exposed, vulnerable. As the silence grew, the officer's mind began to race. He had started this interaction with a certain image of the driver, an image based purely on appearance and assumptions. But now that illusion was shattered. Here was a man with connections with authority, and perhaps even more influence than himself. The officer's initial confidence faltered, replaced by a dawning realization of just how wrong he had been. With each passing moment, the balance of power continued to shift. It was no longer the officer who controlled the narrative. He was now at the mercy of the man he had pulled over. Every question he had asked, every assumption he had made, now felt embarrassingly foolish. and yet there was nothing he could do to take back his actions. The driver, still composed, watched him with an unreadable expression, waiting to see what the officer would do next. As the officer handed back the ID, he couldn't help but wonder, what would happen now? He could almost feel the weight of the driver's gaze, as if those eyes held some silent judgment. Would this man report him? Would he face consequences? The officer realized, with a sinking feeling, that his actions had left him completely exposed. The driver, for his part, had remained calm throughout. Trained to observe, to understand, he saw right through the officer's initial assumptions. He had allowed the scene to unfold, almost as if he were testing the officer, waiting to see just how far he would go before realizing his error. And now, that moment had arrived. In those brief, tense minutes, the roles had shifted so completely that the officer felt a kind of helplessness he had never known. He had gone from holding all the authority to questioning his own judgment, his actions, even his own role. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be on the other side, to be judged, underestimated, and put on the defensive. Assumptions. We all make them. A quick glance, a single moment, and suddenly, we think we know someone. We think we know their story. But what if those assumptions are not only wrong, but also lead to something unexpected, something we didn't see coming? That's exactly what happened to the officer in this story. A lesson in assumptions he would never forget. When the officer first spotted the driver, he didn't see a person. He saw an idea, a stereotype. He believed he could read the situation in an instant. It was something he had done countless times before. Size someone up, decide their intentions, and act based on those snap judgments. But that day, in that moment, he had no idea that his assumptions were leading him into dangerous territory. Each choice, each word he spoke, was slowly leading him toward an outcome he hadn't prepared for. As he approached the driver's window, his mind was already buzzing with conclusions. To him, this driver was just another individual he needed to question, another face in the crowd. He felt a sense of authority, of power. After all, he was the one in control. He was the one with the uniform, the badge, the rules on his side. But what he didn't realize was that he had stepped onto unstable ground. The moment he assumed he understood the situation, he lost control of it entirely. The driver's calm demeanor didn't seem to affect the officer at first. He only saw what he wanted to see, someone to confront, to question, to challenge. But as the interaction continued, something unexpected began to unfold. The driver wasn't reacting the way the officer expected. Instead of nervousness or anger, there was a quiet, composed air about him. He wasn't afraid, wasn't defensive. If anything, he seemed prepared, almost as if he had been through this before, many times. And in that moment, the officer felt a small, creeping doubt. Yet he pressed on, asking questions, assuming his position of power gave him all the information he needed. But with every word, he was missing the subtle cues right in front of him. The driver wasn't just another civilian. He was something else, someone with a history, someone with a background that the officer hadn't even considered. And soon, that truth would surface in a way the officer hadn't anticipated. When the driver finally pulled out his ID, revealing his true identity, the officer felt the ground shift beneath him. All at once, the assumptions he had made began to crumble. This wasn't just any man. This was someone with connections, influence, someone who knew the inner workings of systems the officer could only imagine. In that moment, the officer's power, his authority, felt like it was slipping away. He was no longer the one in control. The assumptions he had made so easily, so thoughtlessly, were now leading him toward a consequence he hadn't prepared for. As the silence grew, he could feel the weight of his mistakes settling on his shoulders. The assumptions that had once seemed so harmless now felt heavy, like chains pulling him down. He had judged this man before even knowing him. He had allowed his own biases to color his perception, and now he was paying the price for it. And what's more, he could sense that the driver knew exactly what had happened. The man didn't need to say anything to show that he understood the situation fully. He didn't need to argue or defend himself. He simply let the officer's own actions speak for themselves. The driver's calmness, his silence, was like a mirror reflecting the officer's own mistakes back at him. In that tense moment, the officer realized that assumptions aren't just harmless thoughts. They have the power to shape our actions, our words, and our decisions. And when those assumptions are wrong, the consequences can be more serious than we ever imagined. He had gone into the encounter thinking he knew who he was dealing with, thinking he had the upper hand. But now, the driver's identity had shattered the officer's carefully constructed view of the situation. His assumptions had led him down a path he couldn't turn back from, and now he had to face the uncomfortable truth. He had misjudged this man, and that misjudgment had cost him dearly. The moment the officer realized who he was dealing with, something shifted. He felt his heart pound, his mind racing through the interaction he'd just had. He'd been the one in charge, the one with authority, or so he'd thought. Now, as he processed the reality of the man sitting before him, he felt that authority slip through his fingers. There was a sense of unease, like he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. This man wasn't just a driver. He was a CIA agent, someone with connections, influence, and an understanding of systems and protocols beyond anything the officer could imagine. And in this moment, it seemed like karma had arrived in full force. The drift. Then, with a steady voice, the driver spoke up, asking for the officer's badge number. A simple question, but one that carried weight. The officer felt his stomach tighten. He knew what that meant. A badge number request wasn't just a formality. It was a sign that this encounter wasn't over, that there could be consequences. His mind began to race. Would this man file a report? Would he call his superiors, using his connections to escalate the situation? For the first time, the officer found himself considering the consequences of his actions, actions that just moments ago had seemed so justified. Karma has a way of arriving when we least expect it. The officer had gone into this encounter feeling confident, certain that he was in control. But now he felt exposed. The power he'd held had shifted to the very person he had underestimated. And this wasn't just a shift in authority. It was a deep, unsettling reminder of the consequences of his actions. His assumptions, his judgment, his overconfidence, all of it was now coming back to him. Karma was unfolding in real time, and he could feel its weight pressing down on him. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The silence between them was thick with tension, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The officer felt trapped, like there was nowhere to hide from the consequences he had set in motion. This man, this CIA agent, held the power to turn his life upside down, and there was nothing the officer could do to stop it. His fate, once firmly in his own hands, now rested with the very person he had underestimated. As the officer watched the driver pull away, he was left alone with an unsettling truth. This encounter would stay with him, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he'd realized too late. That driver, the man he'd approached with preconceived notions, had shown him something far more powerful than a badge or authority. He had given him a lesson, one that would echo in the officer's mind long after he walked away. The importance of respect. From the beginning, the officer had been certain he understood the situation. He believed that he knew who the driver was, what his intentions were, and how he should be treated. But those judgments had been shallow, quick, based only on surface impressions. He hadn't even stopped to wonder who this man really was. Now, as he stood alone, he felt a wave of regret wash over him. If he had approached the driver with even a shred of genuine respect, he might not be facing these consequences. Respect is a word people hear often, but in moments of authority, it can easily slip away, buried under confidence and assumptions. The officer had learned this the hard way. The man he had dismissed as just another driver turned out to be someone with deep influence, someone connected, someone powerful. But the lesson didn't end with the man's identity. This wasn't about respecting people in positions of power. It was about treating everyone with dignity, regardless of who they might be. The officer realized that respect wasn't about rank or authority. It was about seeing people as they truly are, beyond appearances. As he. And in those few minutes, the officer saw a reflection of his own behavior. He saw how his assumptions and lack of respect had created a wall between them, one that the driver had quietly dismantled. It was humbling, even humiliating, to realize that the man he judged so quickly had responded with a maturity and understanding that he himself had failed to show. But this was more than a personal regret. It was a wake-up call. How many others had he judged in the same way? How many people had he sized up and dismissed based on nothing more than his own assumptions? This encounter had been different, yes, but it revealed a pattern, a flaw in his own way of seeing people. He had been so focused on his role, on his authority, that he had forgotten the one principle that should always come first: treat others with respect. As he stood there, the weight of the lesson settled heavily on him. Respect wasn't just about politeness. It was about fairness, about giving people a chance to show who they really are. It was about seeing beyond the surface and understanding that every person has a story, a history, a depth that can't be seen at first glance. The driver had shown him that. Without a single angry word, without a raised voice, he had given him a lesson far more profound than any lecture or reprimand could have. As the officer walked back to his patrol car, his mind was heavy with thoughts he couldn't shake. The entire encounter had only lasted minutes, yet it felt like he had stepped into a moment that stretched endlessly, echoing with a lesson he hadn't expected. All his assumptions, his quick judgments, they had all been shattered in an instant, leaving him questioning not only this encounter but his entire approach to the job. A quiet voice in the back of his mind kept asking him, why do we jump to conclusions about others? And what would happen if we just looked a little deeper? He realized that, like so many others, he had relied on his first impression, his initial instinct. It was fast, efficient, easy. But as he just learned, it was also risky, even dangerous. This was more than just a reminder to give people a chance. It was a lesson in how much we lose when we don't stop to look beyond the surface. Every person he encountered had a life, a story, and experiences that he knew nothing about. By reducing them to his first assumption, he was missing the full picture, and, in many cases, the truth itself. He thought about the driver, that calm yet confident man who had revealed himself to be a CIA agent. At first glance, the driver had seemed just like any other person, maybe someone to question, to assess, and to move along. But the truth had been far more complex. This wasn't someone ordinary. This was a man trained in intelligence, someone who had likely faced unimaginable situations, who had been shaped by experiences the officer couldn't even fathom. Yet in his rush to judge, the officer had been blind to all of that. And now, the reality of what he had missed weighed on him. This, as in the silence of that moment, he thought about how different his life, and the lives of those he interacted with, could be if he made that choice. The truth was, in those few moments with the driver, he had glimpsed a different way of seeing the world. He understood that respect, understanding, and patience were not just values. They were tools that could lead to better decisions, fairer treatment, and genuine connections. The car drove off, leaving the officer alone, but the encounter felt anything but over. The impact of those moments settled heavily on him, haunting him with a profound question. In a world where things aren't always what they seem, is it worth making snap judgments, or should we look a little deeper? This wasn't just a question. It was an invitation to see the world differently, to understand people in a way that went beyond the surface. Yet, standing there, he realized how dangerous that thinking could be. How many people had he sized up in the same way? How many people had he brushed off, dismissed, or categorized based on nothing more than a few seconds? This wasn't just about this one driver, this one day. It was about an entire way of seeing the world, one that left no room for nuance, for complexity, for the rich layers of human experience. And he wondered, with a sense of dread, how many opportunities for true connection and understanding he had missed. The officer thought about the irony of it all. Here he was, someone trained to see, to observe, to act with clarity and judgment. And yet, he'd been blind in the most essential way. The man he'd judged so quickly had held a whole world of experience, knowledge, and depth that he hadn't even considered. The officer realized that every person he encountered could carry that same complexity, that same hidden depth. But if he kept making snap judgments, he would never see it. He began to understand that this question wasn't just about making better choices or being kinder. It was about fundamentally changing the way he saw others. People weren't just quick impressions, labels, or assumptions. They were stories, each one unique and often surprising. And he knew now that unless he chose to look deeper, to move beyond those first impressions, he would always be missing the truth. The question echoed in his mind. Is it worth making snap judgments? For a moment, he thought about how easy it was to answer yes. Judgments were efficient. They saved time, allowed him to make quick decisions. But now he realized those quick decisions came with a cost, one he could no longer ignore. With each snap judgment, he was erasing a person's story, flattening them into something simple, something that fit his assumptions. And that realization was unsettling, even painful. He thought back to the driver, remembering how calm, how composed he had been, even in the face of disrespect and misunderstanding. That man had known who he was. He had understood his own worth, his own value, without needing validation from anyone. And in that calm, in that silence, he had shown the officer a truth more powerful than any words could express. By staying composed, the driver had demonstrated the strength that comes from truly knowing yourself and refusing to let others' judgments define you. And that, the officer realized, was a kind of power he could never achieve by simply relying on his authority. He felt a strange sensation, a sense of responsibility growing within him, as if he now carried a burden of knowing, a weight of awareness that he couldn't shake off. This question, this invitation to look deeper, wasn't going away. It would follow him into every interaction, every decision, reminding him that every person deserved a second look, a pause, a chance to reveal who they really were. As the officer sat alone in his car, he found himself overwhelmed with a feeling he hadn't expected: humility. The kind of humility that came not from being told what he did wrong, but from seeing it so clearly himself. This wasn't a lesson that had been handed to him gently. It had struck him with a force he couldn't ignore. The driver he had judged so quickly had left him with a profound reminder about fairness, a reminder that felt as sharp and clear as if it had been etched into his mind. From the moment he approached the car, he had been operating from a place of authority. That authority was like a shield, a role he had worn like armor for so long. It allowed him to assess, to control, to decide. But he hadn't realized how much that authority had also blinded him. When he first saw the driver, he didn't see an individual with a unique story or worth of his own. He saw what he wanted to see, what he expected to see. And that expectation led him down a path that, he now saw, was flawed from the beginning. What struck him most in that quiet reflection was the realization that fairness should not depend on someone's appearance or status. Fairness wasn't something to be granted based on qualifications or credentials. It was something every person deserved, inherently. But he had violated that principle, and the consequences had been swift and severe. This encounter had shown him a side of himself he wasn't proud of, a side that he knew he needed to confront if he wanted to grow, both as a person and in his role. In that silence, he began to understand what true authority looked like. It wasn't about power, control, or making snap decisions. It was about humility. True authority was grounded in a respect for every person, regardless of their title or appearance. It was about recognizing that his role gave him responsibility, not privilege. And that responsibility required him to approach each person with fairness, no matter the circumstances. The officer thought about the driver again, recalling the calm, quiet way he had handled the situation. Despite the unfair treatment, the man hadn't lashed out or tried to fight back. He had simply shown the officer who he was, allowing the truth to speak for itself. And in that moment, the officer had seen the power of humility and dignity. The driver's calmness had highlighted the officer's own flaws, reflecting back to him the importance of restraint, patience, and, above all, fairness. As he replayed the encounter in his mind, he realized how easy it would have been to avoid this entire situation if he had only taken a moment to approach the driver without judgment, to allow the man to show who he was without assumptions. Things would have been different, but he had chosen authority over empathy, control over curiosity, and now he was left to deal with the consequences. He knew this encounter would stay with him, a reminder that his role came with the responsibility to see beyond the surface, to approach every person with respect, and to treat everyone equally. Fairness wasn't optional, it was essential. He couldn't pick and choose who deserved it based on his assumptions. He needed to give it freely, knowing that it was his duty, his obligation to uphold that principle. Anything less would be a betrayal of the values he was supposed to stand for. But this moment was more than just a humbling experience. It was an awakening, a reminder of the person he wanted to be. He wanted to be someone who could approach each situation, each person, with fairness and integrity. He wanted to be someone who could look back on his actions without regret, knowing he had done his best to treat everyone with the dignity they deserved. And he knew that, moving forward, he would carry this lesson with him into every interaction. In those quiet minutes, he made a promise to himself. He would no longer rely on quick judgments, on shallow impressions, or on assumptions. He would approach each encounter with the humility to know that he didn't have all the answers, the patience to listen, and the fairness to see each person as they truly were. As the officer sat in his car, the reality of what had just happened settled over him like a shadow. A seemingly routine traffic stop, a moment that would normally fade into the blur of his day, had transformed into something profound, something that shook the very core of who he was. He was left with a haunting question. How could one brief encounter unravel so much of what he thought he knew about himself, his work, and the people he encountered every day? Hey, though. The driver, a calm, composed man who turned out to be a CIA agent, had shattered the officer's illusion of control. The man had shown him, without saying a word, just how wrong his assumptions could be. This wasn't just a surprise. It was a revelation, one that felt unsettling and powerful, like a mirror held up to his own flaws. The officer realized that he had been moving through his job, and perhaps his life, with blinders on, seeing only what he wanted to see. And now, in a single unforeseen moment, those blinders had fallen away. As he gripped the steering wheel, he felt his hands tremble slightly. The memory of the driver's composed face, the unexpected authority in his gaze, came back to him. The man hadn't needed to raise his voice or push back. His mere presence had been enough to reveal the officer's errors. And in that moment, the officer felt something he rarely experienced in his line of work: vulnerability. This wasn't the kind of vulnerability that came from being unprotected or unprepared. It was the vulnerability of being seen for who he truly was. The officer had been stripped of his assumptions, his role, and left standing in front of a truth he hadn't wanted to see. A thought crept into his mind, one that felt both enlightening and troubling. How many other moments had he overlooked? How many other encounters had passed by, with truths he had ignored, stories he had dismissed, simply because he hadn't taken the time to look closer? This driver, this one man, had held a depth that he hadn't anticipated. And suddenly, the officer wondered how much he was missing in every interaction, every brief exchange that he so often took for granted. As the moments passed, he felt himself sinking deeper into reflection, as if he were seeing himself and his actions from an entirely new perspective. He realized that each encounter held the potential to reveal something, to teach something, if only he approached it with humility. But how often had he dismissed those opportunities, letting his own judgments cloud his vision? This single moment, this unexpected turn of events, was now challenging everything he thought he knew about himself. In that silence, the officer felt a strange sense of awe. This moment, which had begun so ordinarily, had changed him. It had brought him face to face with his own limitations, his own weaknesses, and, ultimately, his own potential to grow. He knew that he couldn't return to his old ways, couldn't go back to seeing the world through the narrow lens of judgment and authority. This experience, as humbling as it was, had unlocked something within him, a desire to approach each moment with curiosity, respect, and the willingness to learn. He understood now that every encounter had the potential to be transformative. Every person he met could hold a story, a truth that he hadn't seen before. And while he would still carry his authority, he knew that true strength came from being open, from acknowledging that he didn't know everything, that he couldn't see everything with a single glance. In those minutes, standing face to face with someone he had underestimated, the officer had felt a shift within himself, a kind of vulnerability that left him unsettled. He'd been used to relying on his authority, his role, to dictate the terms of each interaction. But here he was, looking into the eyes of a man who hadn't needed any of that. The CIA agent had remained calm, poised, and respectful throughout, even when he could have easily revealed his power. That silence, that composed humility, had spoken volumes more than any argument or show of authority ever could. As he sat in his car, the officer realized just how deeply that humility had affected him. The agent had shown him that true strength doesn't need to assert itself loudly or forcefully. It doesn't need to stand on a pedestal or demand recognition. Instead, it speaks in the pauses, in the silences, in the choice to stay calm when others might expect anger. The officer now saw that humility wasn't a weakness. It was a power that required greater strength than any uniform could give. It was a power that allowed others to see themselves, to recognize their own flaws without a single word needing to be said. The memory of that moment, the way the agent had quietly waited, the way he'd allowed the officer to realize his own errors, lingered in his mind. It had been a powerful display of restraint and respect, qualities that he, as an officer, was supposed to embody, but had somehow forgotten along the way. He thought about how different his life could be if he approached every interaction with that same quiet strength, if he let go of the need to assert his authority in every moment. He thought about all the times he had leaned on his authority, all the times he'd assumed that his badge was enough to control a situation. But he now understood that true respect could only be earned through humility, through a willingness to let others be seen, to let others feel valued. The CIA agent had reminded him of this in the most powerful way possible, not by telling him, not by correcting him, but by simply showing him through his actions. As he continued to sit there, the officer felt a strange sensation. It was as if he were seeing himself for the first time, stripped of his uniform, his role, his assumptions. He felt exposed, yet there was a comfort in this newfound vulnerability. He understood that humility wasn't about diminishing himself. It was about making space for others. It was about understanding that every person he encountered, every situation he faced, held an opportunity for growth, for understanding, for connection. In the days and weeks that followed, this moment stayed with him, shaping how he approached his work, his relationships, even himself. He found himself pausing before each interaction, reminding himself to look beyond the surface, to give others the chance to reveal who they truly were. He discovered that this quiet strength of humility allowed him to connect with people in a way he never had before, to see their struggles, their humanity, without judgment or assumption. This newfound humility didn't make him weaker. It made him stronger, more aware, more human. He understood now that humility wasn't just a virtue. It was a force that had the power to transform, to heal, to build bridges where walls once stood. And though he could never erase the mistakes he'd made, he knew he could carry this lesson forward, using it to become a better officer, a better person.